morning. Thank you very much for attending our MGSM alumni event. And for those who haven't met me, I'm Rebecca Murray, the interim CEO of the association. And isn't it fantastic to have a face-to-face event after 18 months? It's wonderful. Thank you all for braving the weather. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Now, this breakfast is a joint production between our valued sponsor, Indago Digital, and the MGSM Alumni Association. We'll be filming the speakers for the benefit of those who are unable to be here this morning. And this morning's session is going to finish by 9:45 with the Q&A just before that. But feel free to hang around and continue networking. I can see a lot of people catching up, which is great. So feel free to hang around here till about 10:30 if you'd like to. So very quickly and importantly, what is the MGSM Alumni Association? We're an association which is an independent, incorporated association representing the community of the MGSM alumni who work together to reconnect with their fellow alumni in industry in order to realize the value of their investment in the MGSM brand. We were founded by alumni and run by alumni. So before we introduce our sponsor Indago and our guest speakers, I'd like to just point out a couple of other special guests for you. First of all, Lindsay Munns. Where's Lindsay? Yes, Lindsay. Hi, Lindsay. So Lindsay's the chair of the MGSM Alumni Association. And Sarah Greenaway, where is Sarah? Sarah's there, yes. So Sarah is the Director of Marketing Communications at Indago and has put this event together, so thank you very much, Sarah. And I'd like to introduce Karen Beck, who's another special guest. Karen's over there, yeah. And she's representing the Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and we have the banner there. So the MGSM Alumni Association has partnered with the Institute so that we can offer post-MBA courses in sustainable leadership, which are proven to lead to high performance while caring for people and the planet. So some of you may already know Gail Avery through her classes, or the European study tours, the famous European study tours, which I think will be commencing again soon. There's somebody who's been to one of those tours. And so if anyone would like to hear about the new online programs available from the Institute, please have a chat to Karen. And finally, Karen Ganschow. Karen. So Karen is a previous director and chair of the association, and I'll be introducing her later as one of our speakers. So now on to the sponsor for this morning's event, Indago Digital. Indago Digital is one of the country's fastest growing digital agencies, and it features on the AFR's Fast Starters and Fast 100 lists. As well as training for the IAB, for ADMA, for Google Squared Online and the AIM, they're also a Google partner, a Facebook marketing partner, and a Microsoft advertising partner. We're delighted to have Indago as a sponsor of the association, and we thank them particularly for sponsoring this event this morning. Some of you might know Tom Sadler, who was a co-founder of Indago, and Tom is a foundation member of the MGSM Alumni Association, but he sent his apologies because he's interstate. He wasn't able to be here today. And we also have an apology from Gary Nissen, the CEO, who came down with COVID yesterday. So poor Gary is missing out on this event. And he's also feeling quite miserable, and he's in isolation apparently. So, but we have another speaker. I'm delighted to have another speaker to take his place. So these are our speakers for today. We have Preet Singh from Indago, Luke Ashmore-Delaney taking over from Gary, and Peter Dimakidis, all from Indago, and Karen Ganschow, who's going to do our Q&A. So, but our first speaker this morning is Preet, and let me just say a few words about Preet. Preet is the head of performance and analytics at Indago. and he's a visionary data analytics expert who leads a team of performance marketing professionals focused on user acquisition and growth. He's had a career-long fascination with technology, science, and data-related trends, and so he can often see what's on the horizon long before it comes into clear view. He has a double Bachelor's of Business and Finance from Macquarie University. So please join me in welcoming Preet to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Rebecca, for the introduction. I definitely didn't write the intro, so I definitely don't consider myself a visionary of any kind. But hopefully I can provide some insights around data to help you guys moving forwards. We're going to be talking about how you can align your marketing and business data to improve your ROI overall. And that's the topic that we'll be discussing. So let's get into it. Oops, the agenda has popped up again. So I work in a digital marketing agency. We deal with a lot of platforms, a lot of data sets. So something that we usually deal with on the left-hand side are the platforms, that we work on day to day. Our clients probably are looking at platforms on the right-hand side. All of these platforms generate a lot of data on a daily basis, and it's a lot to look at. So I think one thing that we all agree on internally is that we deal with a lot of data. There's a few side effects of having all these platforms and data sets to look at. And it causes a lot of disruptions and discrepancies when you're working on a particular client, for example. As a marketing analyst, we're an agency. We're used to looking at marketing data and advertising data on a daily basis. For us, a platform like Google Analytics, which tracks users on a website, is something that we look at on a daily basis. That's our platform that we look at and report performance on the back of to our clients and to anyone within Indago as well. But on the other side, for a client, for example, a business analyst on the client side might be looking at a completely different data set. They might be looking at some internal data product or a data platform that they have, or a reporting platform that they have, or a CRM system like a Salesforce, for example. So already there is a bit of a disconnect. Between how different teams are looking at data. All these data platforms that we just saw on the previous slide have different tracking methodologies, different ways they report on data, different metrics. And I think this is something that's very visible across the clients that we work with. Usually, a platform like Google Analytics doesn't necessarily always collect the main objective that a business is trying to do. So it might be collecting leads data, but not sales data. And sales data is probably sitting in a separate CRM somewhere, like a Salesforce, as we saw previously. So all in all, when you're looking at all these platforms, different teams, everyone's using different systems, and the main objective isn't necessarily being communicated across everyone as it should be. So there's a pretty significant requirement to work towards a single source of truth, that everyone can look at. All the teams, everyone who's working on a business, different teams, different people should be looking at something consistent across the board. There's a lot of benefit to doing that. First of all, from a marketing perspective, if we are looking at leads data right now, we're probably not optimizing or missing a trick to optimizing our campaigns towards sales. But if we join data sets and if we look at a single source of truth or something equivalent, we can start looking at our marketing campaigns and analyzing performance and optimizing performance towards, sales, things that actually matter to a business. Personally speaking, this is something that happens quite a lot as well. We report on Google Analytics, for example. Client says, I've got 10 conversions, we report 20, and there's always a bit of a friction that happens because of the usage of these different platforms across the board. Once you start looking at the key objective that your business should be looking at across the board, you can improve your budget allocation because you know that you put in X amount of dollars and you got Y amount of sales, and with improved budget allocation, your performance should typically improve as well. And it also improves forecasting because forecasting usually relies on historical data. The better your historical data becomes, the better your forecasting becomes. So that's definitely a big positive. So how do we get to this single source of truth? And obviously everyone looks at the same data. So in theory, the methodology is relatively simple, but it's actually pretty difficult to implement most of the times. What we're trying to achieve here is, if we take an example of two platforms where you're using Google Analytics in an agency and Salesforce within the business, you need something called a key or a unique identifier to join the two data sets. So in its simplest terms, you could potentially use date. So obviously all these platforms would collect date. It's not recommended, but as an example, a simple example, you could join the two data sets on a key, which could be a date, because it would sit across both platforms and you can use it to match the two data sets. Now, that's not something that we do, but as an example, that's something that can be done. So once you've identified that key, there are various ways to join the two data sets. We worked on a few projects internally. Our data team in Datum has worked on a few projects to create this single source of truth. And typically speaking, when identifying this key or this unique identifier, there's two different ways that we can approach this problem. Not problem, but approach this scenario. So one way to look at this is using something called a platform-generated unique identifier. We spoke about Google Analytics. If you have Google Analytics implemented on your website, every time a user comes to your website, Google Analytics would assign something called a client ID to that user. That client ID is actually pretty easy to capture in various platforms, including Google Analytics, and then sending it back to something like Salesforce. And that client ID can be used as the unique identifier for your business for joining the two data sets. As soon as it becomes available in Google Analytics and in Salesforce, you have this key that you can use to join both the platforms. It's unique per user, per browser, so there might be some inaccuracies within the systems, how the data is matched, but it gives you a very good match rate actually. I guess one of the big downfalls of the system is obviously you're relying on a third-party platform for something that's very key to your business. So if Google tomorrow says that we're not going to use client IDs and we're going to use something else, then your implementation is going to be in trouble. The better and harder way is to probably use something that's generated by the website itself. As a website, it's possible to generate a user ID to a client, as Google Analytics does to a user. It's definitely harder to implement because you'll have to create an infrastructure where users are being assigned this user ID. It's also probably more suitable for websites that have some kind of a login system available or a customer portal of some kind, because if you think about it, when you're logging in, or if you have a customer platform of some kind on your website, you're already assigning a customer number of some kind, which can be captured and used as a unique identifier, but not necessarily for something that's a brochureware website or a lead gen website, for example. This unique identifier or this ID is going to be unique per user because we are assigning it, and and it will be more accurate than the client ID, for example, generated by Google Analytics. And obviously it's your own solution, you've created the infrastructure for it, so you own this whole infrastructure, so it's obviously not relying on any third-party platforms. Besides all the benefits of using this single source of truth around budgeting, optimizing campaigns, there's a lot of benefit in just looking at the data. Once you have joined data, your marketing data and your business data, there's a lot of benefit in looking at this data, visualizing it, and then deriving any insights that might come out. You can look at obviously customer lifetime value. You can do without bringing in Google Analytics data as well, but once you bring in something like Google Analytics into the picture, you can start looking at customer lifetime value by your marketing channels. So how is paid search performing by customer lifetime value, paid social, etc., etc. You can start adding different segments that are available in Google Analytics. The data in Google Analytics is very rich. You can have various segments that become available once you join the two data sets to look at your business data as well, like user type. So how are your returning users performing versus your new users to the website, for example. The same analysis can be done on repeat rate, on churn rate, how people are churning on the website. And if you have ROI metrics available, then you can do similar stuff using the ROI metrics as well. And that is me. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Preet, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Peter Dimakidis, our next speaker. So Peter's Indago's Chief Technology and SEO Officer. He's worked with the country's largest brands and evolved over his 20+ year career into a sought-after pioneer of new and innovative approaches to data-driven elements of digital strategy. Peter's insights and strategies are used to boost customer satisfaction, discover new revenue streams, and generally make better decisions. So, over to you, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks again for that wonderful introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about modern day web development. Okay, so one thing's obviously always true, trends always change, and website trends have obviously definitely changed over time. So I've been working in digital for quite some time. I've seen the web evolve quite substantially. One thing that's always been true and always been a pillar to digital success, I guess, has been user experience. Google's always centered itself around focusing its value around the user. And we can actually see this with Google's algorithm updates over time. So back in 2015, Google introduced RankBrain, which is an algorithm update that Google started to focus around what's the user doing? Can we kind of shift the way we're presenting our results based on what users are doing on websites and how they're interacting with the search results? That was a touch in the ocean, I guess you could call it. More recently, last year, Google introduced the page experience update, which was totally centered around user experience. They introduced a new tool called Google Lighthouse, and Google Lighthouse audits how the experience that users are having on your website. It looks at things like performance and usability and accessibility. So I'm going to talk to you about these 5 kind of key areas that I believe you should be looking at when kind of building or maintaining a modern day website. And along the way, I'm going to touch on a few various other kind of topics that I just want to kind of introduce you to if you're not familiar to, I guess. And I guess where I'm trying to go with this at the end is that when we get to full circle, is that a progressive web app almost encompasses all these kind of five areas. So I'm going to talk about headless, and if you're not familiar with what headless is, I'm going to kind of touch on that and a way to kind of build modern day websites that are really performant. It wouldn't be a talk about modern day web tech if I didn't speak about mobile and responsive web design. JavaScript, which can be a bit of an intimidating topic for a lot of people that are kind of very technical. But we're going to talk about how JavaScript's evolved to build very modern, performant websites. And then when we come full circle, we're going to talk about progressive web apps, or PWAs as they like to be referred to. PWAs are essentially a way, or a list of criteria rather, that Google kind of looks at to ensure that your website kind of encompasses all these kind of areas, I guess. So we'll get into it, performance. So there's so many stats around how performance relates to business performance from a digital standpoint, I guess. Better, throughout my career, I've always seen correlations to, website performance, website speed, better SEO, more traffic, more conversions. And this has particularly become really true in the last 2 years, I would say. We run a tool, an internal tool at Indago called Interdatum, and we do a lot of analysis around this. This is just a snapshot out of one of them, and this is always the case whenever we correlate website performance to ranking position. So we audit websites that rank for keywords that our clients want to be listed for, I guess, and a very big scale. And you always see this S-bend when you intersect performance score and ranking position. So it's very interesting to see this kind of evolve over time. And it's definitely the way Google's kind of going with it. Responsive web design. So I think the latest stat that I looked at from Statistio was 57% of total online traffic globally was coming from mobile. Google actually, maybe in the last 5 years, has changed the way it evaluates websites from at least an organic perspective. It almost, prior to that, it almost just looked at your website through the lens of mobile and desktop. Didn't matter, the device didn't matter. Now Google actually separates the way it looks at your website, at least from an index perspective. It will evaluate your website totally differently based on around what it sees from a mobile device or a desktop device, and it actually keeps two separate indexes. We know that speed is obviously a bigger factor when it comes to mobile. That's obviously because of connectivity issues, but obviously the power of the devices that are kind of driving these websites. I don't think this will be a massive. This will decline over time as internet connections get better and devices get more powerful. And I think the key thing here is that are you measuring what your mobile traffic is doing through your Google Analytics or equivalent? And I think what I kind of see, what I have seen in my career is that I tend to just draw a line on mobile and sort of say, here's mobile, here's desktop, and this is what it's doing in terms of your conversion rates, or it might be your engagement. But what I want to kind of encourage is that you go away and have a look at your statistics in a much more granular fashion. So look at it by device, look at it by vendor, look at it by various different screen sizes. Because the thing that you need to keep in mind, obviously, is, and just remind everyone that there are hundreds of different types of devices that out there, in various different sizes, platforms, technologies, right? And what a lot of people might not realize is that your website could look totally different across these. Most of the case, not the case. But it's a possibility. You definitely want to be segmenting that out as much as possible. And testing is a big thing, right? So what can you do to test your website on these various different devices? How is your website conforming to the various different screen sizes, landscape, portrait, tablet, and so forth? And what's actually been presented to the user? If you're designing a website or you're designing pages, I think you need to be considering it from a mobile first perspective these days. That's a given. The other big thing that I think has kind of been mislooked at more recently, just because of the way mobile has kind of taken off, is how does your CMS, your content management system, wherever you're entering your content into, right, allow you to tailor your content and experience based on device or based on the width of your viewport. Do you have options to hide content if it is on a mobile or desktop because you might think your users might be to overload, or what customizations can you do? Really kind of think about how what functionality can you put into your CMS that might be able to tailor your how you deliver your content on device. And we'll talk about PWAs later on, but essentially PWAs are kind of aimed towards more mobile, the more mobile centric. Site architecture. So I've seen a lot of movement in this area over the past few years, and particularly around how we're structuring websites from a content perspective. Definitely see that websites that are well organized, well architected, definitely perform better from a usability standpoint, right? Making your content more accessible, more findable, right, is obviously going to be a good thing. Thinking about how your navigation is structured, but even past that, how people can search for content in various different ways they might be able to find content. And testing, your user flows, how people are finding that content, where are they clicking from, where are they coming in from, where are they coming out from, are there any kind of bottlenecks in the journey in terms of finding that content, really pinpointing those and alleviating those bottlenecks. And the other really big thing is trying to use SEO data around structuring the pillars around your content, right? So typically SEO is aimed around ranking for a cluster of keywords or a particular keyword or various different topics, and looking at that data in terms of how users are searching for it and structuring your website based around that, or at least factoring it in, right, can have a massive advantage around not only ranking higher in Google, but also getting into the mindset of your users and how they might be searching for your content. So what you're looking at here is a Google Trends chart. I'm willing to bet that if you own or operate a website, that it is probably running on something, WordPress or something alike, right? I'm sure everyone would understand what WordPress is. It's a content management system, very available and been around for a very long time. And that's that yellow line there. But what I want to kind of talk about is this explosion of these JavaScript frameworks that seems to be taking over, and almost, if you look more recently, React, which is one of them, is almost about to surpass WordPress, right? And there seems to be definitely a trend moving forward with the way developers are building websites. So I come from a development background. I understand these kind of frameworks quite well, but essentially what they are is frameworks that allow developers to build very interactive websites relatively quickly and efficiently, right? They're very powerful, and they're actually backed by some of, they're backed by big companies. So React is, Facebook or Meta based, and AngularJS is a Google product, right? Back when these frameworks started to kind of come about and developers started to adopt them, there was a massive explosion, but there was actually a bottleneck. JavaScript alone is very bad for SEO. Well, not bad for SEO, but difficult. Google can't actually, in most cases, or back then anyways, couldn't really read JavaScript or kind of index it. But more recently, these additional tools have come out, Gatsby and Next.js, and there are various others, but these are the two of the more popular ones that allow you to build what's called headless websites. And headless basically allows you to kind of encompass the advantages of these JavaScript frameworks and make them very SEO friendly, make them very fast, and kind of make them very compliant for the web, right? And since these tools have kind of come out, there's been a massive explosion around the adoption around trying to build more of these headless type websites rather than something more traditional that you might be familiar with, something like WordPress, which in my experience, has always been very slow and clunky. Not to say that you can't build a great WordPress website, just a lot more difficult, I guess. But essentially, what headless it changes the way websites work. You almost move all your back end and your front end totally separated, whereas WordPress, it's all kind of WordPress alike. It's all kind of encapsulated in the one system. And what you build, or what the developer builds, is this API that connects the two, right? And the tools there, Gatsby and Next.js, allow you to do that. They give you the tools to do that. So PWA is a fairly big topic. I'm going to try and touch on it. The animation's working. So list of kind of criteria or rules that Google will need to be fulfilled to kind of officially say that your website is a PWA, right? And Google evaluates this based on these kind of features and more. But we'll kind of talk about them, and then hopefully there's some questions later on that I can kind of help clear up. So we spoke about mobile. If you have a PWA website, it needs to be fully responsive. I'm sure most websites today are. One of the key differences with a PWA that might be a bit surprising is that it needs to be able to work offline. All right. And so the thing I forgot to mention before I started this slide was that essentially a PWA tries to fill the void that a traditional mobile app might, right? But just on a website, if that makes sense. We're trying to kind of give you that app-like feeling, right, on a website. And I actually think that give it a few more years, traditional native apps may start to kind of take a bit of a decline, and PWAs may become much more popular only because of the discoverability aspect. When you think about really, you only have one way to discover, not one way, but the traditional way to discover a mobile native app is through an app store, a Google Play or an Apple Store, whereas a website's much more discoverable. You have an address, you have it can be found on Google and so forth. But sorry, going back to this, so works offline is really important. So if you think about a native app, right, they do work offline. You do expect it to work without an internet connection. It's what your website needs to do to be PWA compliant. So it's a way to kind of tell the website, well, what do I do? What do I show the user when I don't have an internet connection? What can we do with this? It needs to have app-like interface. So you'll tend to find that it won't have the address bar when it's viewed on a mobile. It's very kind of app-like. Push notifications. Our websites, you can see nowadays, websites do have push notifications. You can opt in for them, but to have a PWA, you need to be able to kind of provide that functionality. They do self-update just naturally as a website does, right? So you don't expect to update a website when you view it. They're much more discoverable than a native app, but the other key thing is that they are installable. So if you've come across, because these have taken off, and you probably have, some of you may have seen these while kind of viewing websites. There will be, if you're on a PWA, you'll know it because it'll ask you if you want to install it. When you accept that, it puts a desktop on, an icon on your desktop, all right? Which allows the user to obviously come back to that website or app, if you will, right? And continue the journey. And actually the adoption has become much better recent times. So Apple's kind of staying away from these, and more recently they've kind of brought them on board. So you can actually install PWAs if you're on an Apple device. It seemed to be more of a Google Play on Android before that. And actually past that now, Windows is accepted them. So if they work just like they would any other desktop application where you have an app that you have on your desktop or an icon that you can install. And that's all.
Thank you, Peter. So our next speaker is Luke Ashmore-Delaney. In fact, our final speaker, although we will get Preet back again and Peter back. So Luke is the Director of Digital Performance and Analytics and the leader of Indago's paid media team. He's a futuristic thinker who enjoys crystal balling what the digital landscape of tomorrow will look like, and he won the Google Performance Honors All-Star Award in both 2019 and 2020. So please join me in welcoming Luke.
Yep. Good morning. Thanks very much for having me here. I'm just going to start with a little bit of context for the digital marketing industry in Australia. So these are stats from the IAB and PwC. There was a good few years of growth for digital, sort of 2016, 2017 into 2018, nice double-digit growth, and then it kind of petered off a bit. People freaked out, went, okay, we've hit the ceiling, digital's not going to grow anymore. And then of course there was the odd years, and it shot right up, 35% growth, up to nearly 13 million across the country. And it's across all sort of dimensions. We've got search growing, displays growing, even the classifieds are growing, so the realestate.com and Cars Guide and everything, all that investment is growing significantly. A lot was sort of, moved from traditional outdoor, and some may go back. But overall, digital is a huge part of advertising in Australia now. But there are some, for us as an agency, this is great. But for some of our clients, maybe not so much. Because the digital market's really matured. It's no longer this new and exciting sort of frontier that we don't quite understand. We all sort of know what we're doing, all of this investment's in there. There's some very knowledgeable players. And our ability to get quick and easy gains is really compromised by that. We can't just sort of, if you've been running a campaign or activity for more than a few years, your campaign's matured, your competitors have matured, and there's only more and more companies and competitors joining the fray. So we're sort of running out of steam in acquisition campaigns. Our sort of roads are closing a little bit in terms of what we can do to really make a big jump for our businesses. So, what happens now? And this is where we bring in CRO. So you've listened to Peter's advice, you've built a great website, all the tech works, Google looks at it and says, great, we're willing to rank it. And then this is basically your next step. So conversion rate optimization, CRO, is increasing your conversion rate by improving key elements of your website. This might be site-wide, it might be individual pages, but basically what we're looking at is a conversion as any desirable action performed by a user on your website. So, hopefully you've made your website with an intent of people doing something, whether it's a purchase, whether it's a call, filling out a form. It can be a button click, time on page. If you have a softer metric, maybe you're there for awareness. But conversion rate is basically the total conversions divided by the total visits. So this is basically a percentage that shows of all the people who come to your site, who's performing this action. So it'd be like the amount of people coming into a shop, how many of those people actually make a purchase. But why is it so effective? Why is it such an integral part of what you need to be doing with your website? It's not limited to a specific channel. So rather than putting your money into paid search or your money into EDMs, an improvement to conversion rate means an improvement across all of your marketing effort. So a rising tide raises all ships. It's very iterative. So you build on, each time you do it, you'll build on your past learnings, and hopefully you'll see cumulative improvements. And it's got a very large effect. So like we were saying before, if you've been running quite mature campaigns, there's not many spaces that you can see to make a big jump in improvement. CRO can allow for a very large improvement even on your already matured and efficient marketing efforts. So is your conversion rate 100%? Does everyone who come to your website actually do what you want them to do? If not, then there's probably gains that you can make. No matter how well designed a website is, your user behavior is what you need to look at changing. So ideally, you're going to have the below. You've got your website that's live, Google's ranked it, traffic's coming to it. You've got editable pages and some web dev resource, and you've got your measurable conversion actions. So you know that what you're actually doing is counting. You've got our fantastic methodology. And even with a few of these, you can still start testing. So you don't necessarily need to have all of these at once before you begin, but you probably will need to have all of them by the end. So when we're looking at site design, we sort of have to ask who designed your website and how. So was it a designer that sort of decided to come in and say, here's what I learned in uni 15 years ago, and that definitely still holds up? Was it a developer who came at it from a purely tech standpoint and wanted to make it as fast and efficient as possible without paying much attention to what it actually looks like? Was it the brand manager who came in and said, okay, well, here's the 30-page brand playbook and every button needs to be the same color? Or was it the CEO who said, you know what, I call the shots here and I want it to look like this? Ultimately, all of these are very sort of opinion-based. That's how we end up with the HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. And really we need to be using data. We need to be using the numbers and the solid maths to make informed decisions and actually drive those results that we want from our website. So in terms of our methodology, the big thing to know is the outcome before we start testing. So a lot of the trap I think people fall into with something like CRO is that they'll sort of put together a plan and say, oh, okay, well, we need to test, so that means we need to get the developer on board and wait the 3 months for his past tickets to clear, and then get a designer in and speak to them and make the page and put it live and hope it all works. But there's a lot of steps you can do before even speaking or even thinking about coding and development, and that is sort of what we look at. So first of all is doing some research. So what do your customers like? You can look at reviews, you can look at how they're acting on the website, putting heat mapping on, and you can look at what competitors are doing. How have they designed their websites? Can you sort of steal a bit from the work that they've done previously in CRO? What do they like? What do you like about their sites? Data and tech. So you're building a hypothesis. You're using your source of truth to say, okay, well, here's what our current conversion rates are. Here, maybe your mobile conversion rate's higher, maybe it's lower, maybe there's something very specific you need to be focusing on. And then using your data from your heat mapping and your user tools, where are people clicking? What are people scrolling? Are they all dropping off at a certain point in your sales funnel? And then design. So rather than sitting down and coding it all out, make an image. Sit down with a designer and say, cool, we just want a nice JPEG showing what our new page is going to look like. And then take it out to surveys. So there's a number of survey platforms available online where you can sort of send these two images out, one of your existing page, one of your new page, and say, what do you prefer? What do you remember? There's sort of 5-second recollection tests. Are people remembering the things you want them to remember? What did they like between the two pages? And then from there, you can build and test. So hopefully your new page has passed the sort of agnostic preference test. If not, go back up to your data and tech and look at your reviews and try and work out what didn't work for people. But then you start to run a traditional CRO campaign. So that's when you build your new page and you'll run an A/B test, a split traffic test of some sort. Again, try to reduce bias as much as possible. And from there, you'll be saying, okay, cool, well, we did all this work beforehand. We are very confident that now that we've got the developer on board and we're putting it live, that we are actually going to see these results. So a little case study that we've got here for National Training, one of our clients. Some of the tactics we used to improve on their original page was a sticky sidebar nav. So people often were scrolling all over the place to try and find out where they wanted to go. So we implemented a feature that stayed with them as they went down the page. Understanding correct USPs. Something really interesting that we almost always see with heat mapping is that people will be trying to click on the unique selling points that are way down the page and ignoring the things that we think are really important. And so that tells us what the customers actually want or want to find out about. And the promotion of price points. Often if people don't see what they want up front, they're just going to leave. If there's too much confusion, they don't really stick around, and they definitely won't go further down the funnel. And the improvement we saw here was a 35% improvement in the conversion rate. So what that ultimately means is if you cast your minds back to all of those dollars that are being spent across the board in digital advertising, each one of those dollars spent is now 35% more effective. Everything going into, on average, so everything going into paid search, going into your organic website build, your EDMs, display, everything else. When people come onto the website, on average, they're 35% more likely to do what you wanted to do to make that purchase. So once you've got all your marketing efforts out there, CRO is really the next step in making them all deliver what you want. And yep, that's me. Thank you.
Hello again. So I'm going to talk about conversion-focused SEO. So we've got a search result here. Most people will obviously realize that on Google, you really have two options to kind of appear. You either have your paid results or your advertisements, commonly referred to as PPC or pay per click, or you have your organic results, typically referred to as organic or SEO. Now, there's a couple of key differences between these which I want to highlight, and that will obviously come full circle as I kind of talk through conversions as they relate on the SEO side. The first thing is obviously that PPC or your advertisements, you need to pay for those, typically on a cost per click basis, right? So it's a bidding model. Whether you're going through Facebook or another search engine, they'll have a platform where you can bid on these on a query level. Whereas on the SEO side, typically referred to as free, although I say free, but if you're paying an agency to do work for you, obviously there's a cost there. But whether or not you're working with an agency or not, you're typically putting resource into making your website better, building up content, or what have you. Paid search is often free. Is often instant in terms of you can set up a campaign in a matter of minutes and be on Google relatively quickly. Whereas SEO takes time, right? So any SEO will tell you that nothing's ever instant on SEO. It kind of takes a bit of time to get a bit of traction. And the main key thing is that paid search is highly trackable. All right. Trackable to very low granularity on a keyword level, on a location level, on a time of day level, and so much more. Very hard to do that same sort of tracking on the organic side. And we're going to talk about how can we bridge the gap and kind of get back a little bit of that data. So like I said, this is a screenshot of Google Ads. This is one level of granularity, but you typically will, a paid search optimizer or a campaign manager will be looking at these sort of things all day. You can get a lot of information around how your campaigns are performing on a conversion level to, like I said, a very good granularity. This is a conversion report in Google Analytics. And most of these channels will have a level of granularity in terms of how you might be able to look at the data and optimize it. But again, it kind of stops there when it comes to organic search. You really can just look at it from a channel perspective. But like I said, paid search is really granular. If you dig down into these, you might be able to segment your email marketing campaigns by various different campaigns or newsletters or whatever it might be, and so forth. If I was to click into the organic, I typically would see this not provided. So I've been doing SEO for quite some time, been involved in digital for a long time, and I remember the days where I could actually get the query level data, right? But now Google, as of 2011, a long time ago, Google buckets it into this not provided, and they kind of center it around user privacy, and they don't give you that data anymore, right? And ever since this kind of happened, we started to have to find ways to kind of how do we kind of understand what's working on an SEO level, at least from a conversion standpoint, right? And we had to kind of reverse engineer it and see how we could get some of that data back. this is called an assisted conversion report. If you're doing Google Ads and you have Google Analytics set up correctly, you should be able to get this report on a query level. And essentially what this will show you is the queries on a query level on paid search and all their associated conversion metrics, whether it be a last click conversion or an assisted conversion, meaning that the query assisted somewhere in the journey in terms of the conversion funnel. This is very valuable information to have as an SEO, because essentially what we can do here is we can look at on a query level what's performing well on paid search and apply those kind of learnings on the SEO side, where we know it takes a lot more effort and time to kind of get that traction and ensure that we're firing our efforts in the right direction. This is a report that comes out of our internal tool, and there's so many ways that you can intersect this data. This is just one of them. But if you're an SEO, you typically would be looking at metrics like search volume for your SEO keywords. Search volume is how many times do these keywords get searched. Another really interesting metric to look at as an SEO is conversion score. All right. Competition score rather. So competition score typically relates to how hard is it to rank for this keyword, how many competitors are there in the market. We'll look at things like how many links they're receiving and how kind of credible they are on Google. And then if you've got your data right, you can bring in conversion score. All right, so you take the information from your assisted conversion report and intersect it over with your queries and start to kind of draw correlations and opportunities around queries that you might want to go after. All right, so this is just one example. The top right is where you want to be. You want to look at those queries and say, oh, they're the highest value or the biggest priorities. Another way you might be able to kind of look at it is, what are my top converting queries that rank on page 2, and how can we kind of optimize those to kind of give them a bit of a push up and get them on page 1 and start getting some value out of them. There's a key saying that it's always been kind of true throughout my career, is that you can't build a successful digital business on paid search alone. And that's typically because the goalposts are always moving. You're always paying for that traffic. It's almost like a drug, right? You need to continuously give it money to kind of get that performance. And if someone else comes in and bids you out of the market, you're in a bad place. So you want to be focusing on both sides of the equation, your organic and paid search. And typically the way I sort of see the most successful kind of long-term campaigns operate is really high spend at the start to kind of get those learnings on your paid media side, and then try and kind of funnel that back down once you start getting traction on SEO. And the longer term play should be SEO and kind of filling in the gaps on the paid search side. Although obviously everyone's case will be different and scenario will be different. If you're getting performance on paid search, there's no reason why you would stop that. So there's a couple of caveats to this kind of methodology, right? Typically your paid campaigns will be focused around some sort of ROI metric, right? So if a keyword's costing more than it's returning, it will probably get wiped if it's being optimized correctly. But the ROI element there is not kind of going to always be true on the SEO side, right? Because you're getting much more bang for buck on the SEO side. So what I would recommend there is that if you're looking to take this methodology on, don't just center around the keywords you're bidding on. Try and test queries, even though they may not be profitable on the paid search side. Try and test those queries and see what return you can get out of them so that you can take those learnings into your SEO campaigns. And you always want to be tracking, as Preet mentioned in his first talk, to a completed sale or order, not just an inquiry, right? And if all your ducks are aligned and you've got all your tracking sorted and you're doing a good job of your tracking, as Preet mentioned, the holy grail would be that you're tracking to an ALT, average lifetime value, right? That's a really hard thing to do in my experience, and typically only really comes when you've got your offline and your online and your CRM data all kind of really well playing together, and kind of pushing into all the various different systems so you can be doing this type of optimization. But that is the holy grail. If you can kind of get to that level, you'll be making the most informed decisions. Thank you.
Thank you for bearing with us so far. I promise this is the last presentation that we've got for you. We'll be talking about paid media automation and how robots will take over and such. So nothing can stop automation. Like, I think we all agree on that. It holds true for paid media as well. Obviously, frustrations remain still, as we can see in that last kind of picture. But paid media automation is here, and we should be utilizing it across our paid media campaigns. So why do we need paid media automation? I think Luke touched on it briefly. Paid media is difficult. Every incremental dollar, making that work is difficult. So, if you invest $100, it's probably easy to get $100 or $200 back, or whatever your target is. But the next 100 is going to get more difficult, and so on. So you need everything that you can do, including things like CRO and what Peter touched on, to make sure that your campaigns are performing optimally. There's a lot going on in paid media. You can track paid media, which is obviously great, and you get all this information, and all these informations you have to analyze as well. So there is that's the flip side of actually working in paid media. You get a lot of data, but then this data becomes difficult to manage as well. If you're working in a paid media environment, you might have looked at keywords. Audiences are available across all platforms, demographics, devices, and a whole heap of other metrics and things, segments that you have to look at. It's almost impossible to manage all this manually. You cannot do it. It's impossible for a single person to look at all this data. And that's why we need automation. All the platforms or most of the platforms that we worked on or provide paid media services, they use something of it like a auction model or a bidding model, as Peter touched on it briefly. So you can bid on keywords and audiences and so on, and create your campaigns accordingly. All these platforms offer certain bidding algorithms or bid strategies, and that's what we'll be focusing on, which is how you can automate your campaigns and hopefully improve performance. And obviously all these bid strategies use the good stuff, AI, machine learning. Obviously no presentation is complete these days without mentioning AI, so obviously I had to put it in there. So let's talk about a brief history of these bidding strategies. So if you asked us maybe 3 or 4 years ago, bid strategies weren't probably the preferred way to manage a campaign because they weren't that good. Manual intervention or manually managing the campaigns was almost as effective, if not, better than what bidding strategies provided. But over time, things have changed. The way the platforms work changed. The amount of data that's available or has become available for these bid strategies to learn has changed. So there's a big push for all these platforms towards consolidation as well, which we are seeing. So Facebook, Google Ads, and such, they're using consolidation as a method to feed more data to these bidding algorithms, basically, and hence they're getting better. And we are at a stage where bidding strategies are consistently outperforming manual strategies now. So it's definitely true for most of our clients, I'd say, especially clients that have a larger scale. Obviously, you can't manage all the things that we spoke about manually, but also the performance of the bid strategies across bigger clients is certainly better. So what are the options available? So this is a pretty generalistic view of what's available across different platforms in terms of bid strategies. Most of these platforms provide bid strategies or recommend bid strategies based on your objectives. So these objectives are broadly categorized as awareness, traffic, conversions, and ROAS, return on ad spend. And within each of these categories or each of these objectives, you'd find whatever options are available within the platforms. these options like target impression shares available in Google Ads might be called something else in another platform. So if your objective is conversions, you want to drive maximum amount of conversions, you might want to opt for either maximize conversions bid strategy or a target cost per acquisition type bid strategy. So it's important to analyze what your objective is and then work through the different options that are available in whatever platform you're in, and then select a bid strategy that works. What's the process of implementing these bid strategies? So generally speaking, this is what you'd probably do. First step is always to set up conversion tracking. If you don't have conversion tracking set up, we definitely recommend setting up some kind of a proxy for your conversions. So for example, if you don't have anything, you're a brochure web website, just want traffic to your website. So maybe you can set up a conversion for a particular landing page that's important to you and optimize your campaigns towards that. We say that because conversion focused and revenue focused bid strategies tend to work better than just open-ended bid strategies that target awareness or traffic, for example. Once you've set up your conversion tracking, give some time to collect data. The data requirements for these bid strategies to work has reduced quite a lot because over time they've learned to be almost self-sufficient. So you don't really need that much data, but 3 to 4 weeks of historical data is something that is a bare minimum that we recommend. And then moving on to implementing the relevant bid strategy. So obviously it's going to be based on your objective. So if your objective is ROS, then maximize revenue or something like that would be the bid strategy that you'd hopefully go for. Once you implement this bid strategy across all these platforms, the system will take the bid strategy into what's called a learning period. So this learning period can last anywhere between 5 and 7 days. So you have to be a bit patient during that learning period, let the bid strategy learn, and then just hopefully it comes out of that learning period after that time period. Once the bid strategy is running, obviously don't just let it run. You have to analyze performance. So most of the platforms that provide bid strategies will provide some sort of recommendations and so on. And you do need to look at them regularly and work out if there's any changes that you need to make. And that's it. So once you've set it up, analyze performance, and then make any changes necessary. There's some best practices that you should be following. Some of them we've already spoken about, but reiterating again. Obviously select a bid strategy to match your objective. If your objective is return on ad spend or revenue type objective, you should be looking at implementing a strategy that does that. Use conversion tracking again. This is pretty important because, as I said, the conversion focused bid strategies do tend to work better. So the more conversion focused data that you can provide to a bid strategy, the better the performance will be, hopefully. This is something that all of us struggle with, clients struggle with, and we struggle with as well. Once you've implemented the bid strategy, the performance will fluctuate, usually towards the worst for a certain period. But then over time, it averages out and it does outperform the manual intervention side of things. So there is a requirement for everyone to be patient and let the bid strategy or the algorithms do its thing. Don't make too many manual interventions. Once you've selected or once you've decided that I want the algorithm to take over and just do things, if you start making too many interventions, like changing keywords at a scale and so on in a campaign, you run the risk of the bid strategy going back into the learning period, and then that means you have to wait another 7 days and then another 7 days for performance to fluctuate, and you've kind of lost ground, probably 2 weeks worth of data and performance. As I said, it's not a set and forget solution, so you can't just let it run wild. You have to come into the platforms and check what it's doing. As I said, some of these systems are very good to a level where they'll recommend what the target should be. So for example, if you selected a target cost per acquisition type bid strategy and your target was 500, and the bid strategy worked out that it can provide you conversions at 450. It will tell you that. It will say you can get these many conversions at 450, and you should look at it and change accordingly. And not everything can be automated, so I'm definitely suspect of this behavior. Not all campaigns are prime candidates for using a bid strategy, even though the data requirements are very limited these days. You can run a bid strategy on very limited data. But if you're running a burst for 2 weeks, there's no point running a bid strategy on that, because by the time the bid strategy learns, your campaign will finish. There are certain campaigns that there is no way to have any kind of conversion data available at all, and for those cases as well, it might not be very efficient to run a bid strategy, and where manual will supersede bidding strategies. And I believe that is the end. Thank you very much for your time. Obviously, for all your digital needs, come to Indago Digital.
Thank you, Preet. This has been some amazing information. We're now going to move on to the Q&A session, and I'm delighted to introduce our facilitator, who is Karen Ganchar. So Karen is the head of data sciences at Aware Super. And she lectures at the master's level in marketing and customer experience at both Macquarie Uni Business School and also Sydney Uni Business School. Karen has won just about every award you can win as a senior marketer. She is the guru. And welcoming Karen onto the stage.
So are my people I'm inquisiting?
They're coming up.
This is the Karen Ganchar Inquisition session. But remember, this is a crowdsource, so we're co-creating all those terms in marketing. This is how we ask questions together. Come on, Luke. Come on, all right. So, Preet, Luke, Peter, thank you so much. Someone who spent more time in this space trying to unpack the dark part of digital marketing. It was really, really helpful. I will take the facilitator right to ask the first question, but I'm going to hand over to the crowd as soon as we can. So it is one of those truisms of the business. I think it was set in 1950 actually. I know my advertising works. I know half of my advertising works. I don't know which half. That stands the test of time, and so it still becomes a debate for the business, for someone running their organisation when they've got a budget. Let's go $10,000. One would assume with all the great tools that you've just described, we should know exactly how that's performing. But I was keen to ask you, we talked about the ultimate goal of attribution, and that customers are very untidy, and they don't follow a linear pathway to conversion. If you were talking to a client like myself, how would you counsel me to work out how much I should spend on SEO, how much I should spend on paid search, how much I should spend on advertising in Facebook, how much I should spend on News Corp digital marketing, and then remarketing, because that's like just even a sort of subset of the portfolio, like talk about out of home and radio and TV and others. So how, with all the tools you've just described and the learnings you've gathered over time, what's the best way for a client to orchestrate their budget?
Yeah.
Got a switchboard?
I think first of all, if you're not investing in SEO, as Peter mentioned, it's a long-term goal, so that needs to be happening at any given point. Beyond that, for sort of direct investment channels, I think a lot of it's how mature your company is and where its other campaigns are at. If you're fresh into the market, then there might be some awareness activity you want to do, so using the programmatic News Corp display channels, and then using paid search as well to gather data on your customers. And if you've been running activity for a long time, then you should have somewhere a wealth of data to sort of draw upon and say, okay, well, here's our core customers. Take that and say, are we getting the return we want? Maybe segment out 20% of those profits and look into sort of untested channels from there. You guys have?
Yeah, I'll probably follow the very exact approach, to be honest. I think there's a few questions that it's a pretty open-ended question because there's a lot of caveats in this question as well. So I think it just depends on firstly what maturity level the client is at. If there's data available, you can definitely look at tools like Google Analytics to see what proportion of traffic is coming from what channel and how it has performed over time. Hopefully your conversion tracking, etc. is all set up correctly for you to be able to analyze that information. And then based on that, I think make decisions on budgeting. So I mean, typically the plans that we work on, because we're a performance agency, we always recommend paid search as the primary kind of paid media channel, purely because it's the best performing. And if there are requirements for awareness activity, for example, because at certain stage you're going to run out of your audience pools, and at that point you probably need to do a little bit more awareness to bring new users back to your website, so that you can extend or continue building these cookie pools, and that's where the awareness activity would come into play. And then I think SEO is obviously a huge part of all of this. If you look at all our clients, on an average between 60 and 70% of their traffic is not paid, and that's potentially where people want to be, because as Peter mentioned, you can't just rely on paid traffic as a long-term strategy.
I was just going to add, I'd 100% agree with that. But just to reaffirm, I think it really depends on what your short-term goals are. And if a client came to me and said to me, got $10,000 to spend over the year, and I need to maximise the amount of conversions we receive, whether it be sales or revenue for an e-com shop, it's going to be hard to get that traction in a year. On the SEO side, if you shoveled all that into your organic campaigns, all right, paid search may be more of a viable candidate there, or paid social, whatever it might be. If you're like Preet and Luke said, more mature and been around for a longer time, then you may start to consider investing in kind of some of those more longer term kind of channels like SEO, where it does take a little bit more time to kind of get that traction. Yeah.
Any questions from audience?
I'll go, Karen.
Great, thank you. We're going to sing the microphone. Come and do the karaoke.
So I can yell.
No, yeah, I think the recording will need you.
Preet, early on you spoke about unique identifiers, and obviously it's a massive challenge trying to get that single source of truth. With the changes that are coming through on cookies and that continued evolution, and you said it yourself, what happens if GA wake up one day and say, see you later, client IDs? How likely do you think that continued evolution towards kind of removing that free access to information is likely to be? Yes.
I think it's unlikely that Google Analytics will get rid of that whole client ID situation, to be honest. And the client ID is generated by a first-party cookie, which is still going to be around. So a lot of the cookie chatter has been around third-party cookies, which is not something this client ID solution relies on. Google released this new version of analytics, GA4, a couple of years ago. That system still uses the client ID as the primary way to identify a user. So I'm sure if they're using the same solution in GA4, they probably have figured out that this is not going away anytime soon. So although yes, there is a risk of you relying on a third-party solution, but then I think a lot of businesses rely on a lot of third-party platforms as well, like for EDMs, for example. Similar thing can happen across all the other platforms as well. So I think it's a risk, yes. I'm not quite sure how you prepare for it without generating a client ID or a unique identifier yourself as a website. I don't believe there is any other way to do it. You either rely on this solution or you do it yourself. But I think it's unlikely that the client ID is going away anytime soon.
I wondered if you could suggest further reading or ways to follow this particular subject that you've introduced to me so carefully and clearly today. I don't want to stop where I've got to today. I want to keep up with it. If you've got any ideas, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
So what's your go-to for keeping on top of the ever-evolving world of digital marketing? Sign up with Indago, is it?
I do a menu.
It is true, there is a newsletter.
So are we opting us all into your newsletter? All right.
Good idea.
I mean, I guess a lot of it comes out of announcements through Google and Facebook. There's various, I guess, industry journal sites. One's called Search Engine Land, and another one's called Search Engine Journal. And those two will usually, any major sort of release from a Google or a Facebook or anyone else will be reproduced there, and there's also going to be opinions and that sort of thing along with that. If you want to do, I guess, training on a lot of the topics, like your own self-paced training, Google has something called the Skills Shop, which just has courses, and so you can do little exams, and you can actually be certified through Google in a lot of those topics. Then you can sort of put that in your LinkedIn or whatever you might want to do after that.
I think that's
kind of add all kind of websites that Luke mentioned and any others that are kind of relevant. And it's all about how much information you want, obviously. But I'd be happy to share that with anyone, so you can I can link you into it, and then you can you just got a feed of information coming in every day, and I'd be happy to share that with you. Yeah.
I'll ask one more question, and we probably need to wrap it up. Peter, you talked about the different behaviours of the consumer on mobile versus desktop. Certainly been my experience that you get a lot of frequency on mobile, but the real heavy-duty transactions, consumers go to desktop because they need a larger format for things like home loans or shopping for something that's a bit more involved. But I was wondering if that's changing, because I think the mobile first explosion is there, and I would have thought there's even more traffic now coming on mobile than we've seen. I wondered, looking forward, what do you think people need to plan for in terms of the different form factor and transactional behaviour on those different sites?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. There's a few things to consider. I think the big thing for me is, and it goes back to tracking and everything we've spoken about today, is I believe the term's called cross-device tracking. Is that right? So that's a feature that you can set up in Google Analytics, and I believe it does require on that unique identifier kind of situation when you're pushing that back into Google, right? And what that will help you do is understand the attribution level on a device category, right? So and what I've typically seen is that most of the time conversations or journeys start on a mobile device, like you kind of mentioned, and end on a desktop, right? So it's someone, researching on the way to work and doing what they're doing, and then they get home and they're ready to buy. And I think everyone's situation is going to be different. Every industry is different. Every product is different, right? So there's no kind of one, system fits all. So I can't really kind of answer that. But I think the main thing for me is just tracking it, right, and understanding what does that journey look like, and can you kind of put that that tracking in place so that you can understand how much mobile is attributing to the final kind of conversion piece.
I'd probably just add to it that if there's the conversion point is something like a lead gen form or a really lengthy form like a home loan application, it's definitely in that scenario I think desktop is key. But for transactional data like a retail or a shopping website, mobile is definitely catching up, because all these platforms have one-click buy solutions now. You're logged in. You can use Google Pay and whatever. You need to enter your credit card information. So the process is a lot easier if transactional websites where you can actually purchase a product, and that's obviously leading to more and more people actually buying on a mobile device and not relying on desktop.
Yeah, just a little bit further to that, in terms of forms and things, we actually ran a CRO test explicitly for mobile for one of our clients, and there's so much you can do to make that experience more painless. And in terms of, it's just very simple things, like if you're on a mobile device and you press the field for entering a phone number, it brings up your numbers keyboard. Or when you have to put in your state, it brings up the little dot options to choose from rather than typing New South Wales in on your keyboard. There's so many little quality of life improvements that honestly stack up and make a huge effect as to how willing someone is to fill out this form. And even just putting the form at the top of the page rather than, or on a desktop, it'd still be there on the screen, but people don't want to be scrolling to try and find what you want them to do. You make it as easy as possible for them to buy from you. They'll be happy and you'll be happy.
I've got to ask one more question and we'll wrap it up. You can't go to a digital conference without talking about personalisation. And even 10 years ago, it was really important that you understood where the customer was in their journey, both in the keyword that they entered and then what you presented to them online. But it always seemed just really hard. Is it still really hard? Is it something that's like over the horizon, we'll just keep chasing it, or is it something now that's a reality that the expectation is you give a visitor the personalised experience, they'll reward you with a higher conversion rate on the site?
Yeah, it still is quite hard. And I think the third-party cookie sort of slow death has set us back a little bit for that. But in terms of knowing what channel they came from and if it's paid search, what terms they've been using, that can at least give you some good indication, even if it's not on the website, but at least pre-site. So if you're looking at the ads and the creative that you're using, that can help influence and understand. If they've never been to your website before, if they're definitely not a previous user, you can treat them one way, and if then you've got their email on file, and you can say, cool, we know that you've been here before, you can treat them a very different way, especially in the way you advertise to them before they even come on your site.
Yeah, I'll probably get on very similar note. It's still doable, but it's the dream isn't over yet. But I'd say what was promised is probably never going to be fulfilled. This is what I would be.
You've got to crack that course there.
With how personalization and privacy are conflicting topics, so I'm not quite sure how you can achieve that and also be privacy compliant. So I think there are workarounds to it, as Luke mentioned. Google's working on, and all these platforms obviously are working on other ways to identify a user, which is privacy compliant and whatnot. But for me, especially, I think it's never going to be as accurate as identifying someone as a person, as opposed to inferring who that person is, which means that your personalization is probably not going to be accurate as well.
Uplift us, come on. We need a final line that makes us feel, yes.
No, I was just going to say, I haven't worked on a lot of personalisation projects, but there has been one. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention it, but they're one of the casinos, so there's two in Australia, you can probably figure out who. For me, there are levels of how far you can take it. So I think if you've got some sort of membership system, or probably the most best way to describe it would be if you're an e-com shop, ASOS, and your users logged in and they put in information about who they are and male, female. I mean, you're going to customize the website and personalize it based around that, right? Like Luke said, when it comes to, from a marketing standpoint, someone coming in through a paid search ad or SEO, it is very difficult at present. A lot more easy on the paid search side, I'd imagine, because, and we do this already, we do a lot of this around optimized landing pages centered around the keyword that the user might have typed in, and we definitely see massive improvements in engagement and conversions off the back of that. But I think it all comes down to how much information you have about your customer. And if you've got some sort of login system, then definitely you should be exploring that, because you've collected that information and you can customize the website based around what you know about your customer. And yeah, I think that's kind of I think it's going to be a big thing moving forward, but it's still going to take some time to get there.
I think make it feel special, but always honour their privacy. That's really important. All right, thanks. Back to you. Thank you.
I just want to thank you all so much, including Karen for facilitating that session, but to Luke and Peter and Preet for an incredibly educational and content-rich session. And I really thank you for the effort you've put into your slides and the presentation today. In fact, I think that either Sarah or I, within the next day or two, will get the slides to you so that you have them. So it's almost a crib sheet on what you need to be doing in your organisations. So I think that has been a very valuable session for the alumni and guests. And so we're very grateful to Indago for the effort you've put into this and to sponsoring the session today. Thank you. Also, by the way, we have taken a video of today's session, and so that will be available online on the MGSM alumni website. So have a look out for that, but that could take about a week. So our next live event is for MGSM graduates who are also CEOs and MDs, and that's on April the 28th. And if you haven't had an invitation to that, perhaps we haven't yet identified you as a CEO, so please come and talk to me. I know there are a couple of people here who are already coming to that event. Please again chat to Karen Beck from the Institute of Sustainable Leadership about the online courses for your teams. So although the formal event is now concluded, please feel free to stay around and talk further networking until around 10:30. Thank you all very much for attending, and thank you again to Indago. Thank you.